On June 14, 1710, 10 overcrowded ships dropped anchor in New York Harbor, carrying nearly 3,000 German refugees from the Rhineland-Palatinate. At that point, it was the single largest immigrant convoy ever to arrive on American shores at once, a full year before anyone had even coined the phrase melting pot. These were farmers, tanners, and printers who had watched their homeland repeatedly burned by French armies during decades of religious and territorial war. They had also survived one of the worst winters in European memory, the Great Frost of 1709, which froze rivers solid and destroyed crops across the Rhine Valley. Queen Anne's government shipped them across the Atlantic as part of an experiment, using indentured laborers to produce naval supplies for the British fleet. The experiment mostly failed. What succeeded instead was something nobody in London had planned for at all. Those refugees, along with the tens of thousands who followed over the next several decades into New York's Hudson and Mohawk valleys and into Pennsylvania, quietly became one of the largest and most overlooked founding populations in American history. They arrived with no famous compact, no ship remembered the way people remember the Mayflower, and no monument standing at Plymouth Rock. They came with debts to repay, a language almost nobody around them understood, and hands that knew how to farm, print, preach, and build. 400 years of quiet compounding transformed that frozen and half-starved convoy into something almost nobody would guess from the way their story began. 15 surnames are coming up in this video. One leads to the trial that helped establish freedom of the press in America, decades before anyone wrote the First Amendment. One leads to the Prussian officer who transformed a starving, half-armed militia into an army capable of defeating the British Empire. And one leads to a community of families who still farm with horses and refuse the electrical grid, much as their ancestors did after arriving in America. Is one of these 15 names sitting in your own family tree? Because by the end of this video, there is a number waiting for you that may make you look at your own surname completely differently. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, and let's get into it. Number 1, Herkimer. Johann Jost Herkimer was among the Palatine refugees who came ashore in the 1710 convoy, one of thousands processed through temporary camps along the Hudson River. The refugees were eventually resettled farther inland, including in the Mohawk Valley of central New York, where the British hoped they would produce tar and pitch for naval ships. The tar production scheme largely failed. The farming did not. Herkimer's family established itself in the Mohawk Valley, anglicized the surname to Herkimer, and built a life on the edge of colonial settlement beside Iroquois territory. 2 generations later, his grandson, Nicholas Herkimer, became a militia general. In August of 1767, he led roughly 800 Patriot militiamen into an ambush by Loyalist and Iroquois forces at the Battle of Oriskany, one of the bloodiest engagements of the Revolutionary War relative to the number of men involved. Herkimer was struck in the leg by a musket ball early in the fighting. According to surviving accounts, he propped himself against a saddle beneath a beech tree, lit his pipe, and continued directing the battle for hours while wounded. His forces held the field. He died from complications of the wound 10 days later. Herkimer County, New York, still carries his name today. A family that arrived as frozen, indentured refugees in 1710 gave the American Revolution one of its most quietly heroic and least remembered generals. Number 2, Zenger. John Peter Zenger arrived as a child during that same Palatine migration of 1710, apprenticed as a printer in New York, and by 1733 was publishing his own newspaper. That newspaper was called the New York Weekly Journal. In 1734, Zenger's paper printed articles sharply criticizing New York's royal governor, William Cosby, accusing him of corruption and abuse of authority. Cosby had Zenger arrested and charged with seditious libel. Under the law as it then existed, the prosecution did not need to prove that the criticism was false. It only needed to prove that the statements had been published. Zenger's defense attorney, Andrew Hamilton, argued directly to the jury that truthful statements could not reasonably be considered libelous, regardless of what the strict letter of colonial law said. In 1735, the jury acquitted Zenger outright, openly defying the judge's instructions. The case became one of the foundational precedents behind the American understanding of a free press. For the following century and a half, it was repeatedly cited as proof that the printed word could be used to hold political power accountable, 4 decades before anyone wrote the First Amendment. A Palatine refugee child, transported across the Atlantic as part of an indentured labor scheme to produce tar for the Royal Navy, ended up placing his name on one of the earliest legal victories for press freedom in the English-speaking world. Number 3, Ludwick. Christopher Ludwick left the German state of Hesse in 1754 and arrived in Philadelphia, carrying a practical trade with him, baking. By the time the Revolutionary War began, Ludwick had built a strong enough reputation that the Continental Congress appointed him superintendent of bakers for Washington's entire army. He became the man responsible for ensuring that thousands of exhausted and frequently half-starved soldiers had bread to eat. Ludwick baked, organized, and fed the Continental Army through some of its darkest periods. including the brutal winter encampment at Valley Forge. At times, he reportedly refused additional payment for the work out of loyalty to the revolutionary cause. When Ludwick died in 1801, he left most of his considerable estate to establish a school for poor children in Philadelphia. The school was explicitly open to children of every religion and background, at a time when charitable schools were usually tied to one particular church or denomination. The Christopher Ludwick Foundation still exists today and continues funding education for underprivileged children in Philadelphia. More than 2 centuries later, the legacy remains active because one German baker decided that feeding an army was not enough to leave behind. Number 4, Zeisberger. David Zeisberger was born in Moravia into the German-speaking Moravian Brethren tradition and arrived in Pennsylvania as a young man to join the Moravian mission community at Bethlehem. He spent most of the next 6 decades living among and ministering to Lenape and other native communities across Pennsylvania and the Ohio country, learning multiple native languages fluently enough to preach, translate scripture, and negotiate on behalf of the communities he lived among. Zeisberger founded a series of mission towns intended to serve as havens of peace between colonists and native nations during some of the most violent decades of the frontier era. But that mission was not always enough to protect the people he served. One of his former mission communities, Gnadenhutten in Ohio, became the site of a horrific massacre in 1782 when Pennsylvania militiamen killed unarmed Christian Delaware converts. Zeisberger was not present during the massacre, but the atrocity devastated him for the rest of his life. He continued working among native communities until his death in 1808, leaving behind detailed diaries and dictionaries of native languages that remain valuable historical and linguistic resources today. If the name Zeisberger appears anywhere in your family tree, you are looking at a life spent almost entirely in the space between 2 worlds that were, more often than not, actively at war with one another. Number 5, Schlatter. Michael Schlatter was a German-speaking Swiss minister who arrived in Pennsylvania in 1746 with a specific and enormous task: organizing the scattered and largely leaderless German Reformed congregations spread across the colony into something resembling a functioning church structure. Before Schlatter arrived, German Reformed families across Pennsylvania sometimes went years without a trained minister, a baptism, or a formal congregation. Schlatter spent years traveling between isolated communities, founding churches, recruiting additional ministers from Europe, and helping establish what became the CODIS of Pennsylvania. That organization became the structural backbone of the German Reformed Church in America. Schlatter is remembered today as the founding organizer of an entire American denomination, built almost single-handedly from scattered farming families who arrived with their faith but no stable institution through which to practice it. Number 6, Boehm. Martin Boehm was born in Pennsylvania to a Mennonite farming family descended from earlier German and Swiss immigrants, and he became a Mennonite preacher himself while still a young man. In 1767, during an outdoor religious gathering, Boehm delivered a sermon that deeply moved a German Reformed minister in the crowd named Philip William Otterbein. According to the traditional account, Otterbein approached Boehm after the sermon, embraced him, and said simply, "We are brothers." That meeting, between a Mennonite preacher and a Reformed minister from 2 separate German religious traditions, became the founding moment of the United Brethren in Christ. It was one of the first genuinely homegrown American religious denominations built specifically across the divisions that had separated Pennsylvania's German church communities from one another. If your family carries the Boehm name, you are connected to the moment when 2 distinct strands of Pennsylvania German religious life decided to stop being separate at all. Subscribe right now, because the next names take us out of the churches and onto the roads, factory floors, and battlefields. Coming up is the wagon company that became one of America's largest truck manufacturers, while the officer who rebuilt an entire army from the ground up, and a steel empire created by a Pennsylvania Dutch farm boy. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Number 7, Mack. The Mack brothers, John, Augustus, and William, were the sons of a Pennsylvania German immigrant family working in Scranton during the late 1800s. In 1900, the brothers founded a small wagon and carriage-building shop in Brooklyn. Within a decade, they had shifted almost entirely into motorized trucks, designing vehicles tough enough to survive punishing working conditions on construction sites and industrial projects. Mack trucks became one of the defining names in American heavy industry, and its bulldog hood ornament eventually became one of the most recognizable symbols in transportation history. It is a quieter story than some of the others on this list. There is no single dramatic battlefield moment, just generations of Pennsylvania German engineering instinct, first applied to wagon wheels, and later applied to diesel engines. Number 8, Chrysler. Long before Walter Chrysler built a car, his family story began with Palatine German immigrants who settled in colonial New York during the 1700s. They belonged to the same broad migration movement that brought families such as the Herkimers and Zengers across the Atlantic. The family name was gradually anglicized over successive generations until it eventually became Chrysler. Walter grew up far from Wall Street and began his career working as a machinist and railroad mechanic in Kansas. He rose through the ranks of the American automobile industry before founding the Chrysler Corporation in 1925. Within only a few years, Chrysler had become one of the big three American automakers. The Chrysler Building in Manhattan, briefly the tallest building on Earth, still carries his name today. A Palatine farming line that began by clearing land in the Hudson Valley eventually saw its surname written in steel across the Manhattan skyline. Number 9, Schwab. Charles M. Schwab was born in the small Pennsylvania Dutch town of Williamsburg into a Catholic family of German colonial descent. He began working at 17 as a stake driver in a steel mill for $1 a day. By his mid-30s, he had become president of Carnegie Steel, the man Andrew Carnegie personally trusted to run the largest steel operation on Earth. After helping engineer the sale of Carnegie Steel that created United States Steel, Schwab went on to build Bethlehem Steel into an industrial giant in its own right. The company supplied steel for skyscrapers, battleships, and an enormous share of American military production during both World Wars. From a Pennsylvania Dutch farm town to running some of the largest steel operations in human history, the Schwab name became, for an entire generation, almost synonymous with the phrase captain of industry. Number 10, Steuben. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben wasn't a Palatine farmer at all. He was a Prussian military officer, and his story shows just how broad the German contribution to early America actually was. Steuben arrived at Valley Forge in early 1778, brought in specifically to help fix an army that was freezing, starving, and barely functioning as a disciplined fighting force. He reportedly spoke very little English when he arrived, and often drilled troops through a translator. Steuben personally trained Washington's soldiers in formation, discipline, camp organization, and battlefield maneuver, and wrote what became the Continental Army's first standardized drill manual, commonly known as the Blue Book. Historians consistently credit his work at Valley Forge as one of the turning points that transformed the Continental Army from a loose collection of scattered militias into a force capable of standing against British regulars. A German officer who barely spoke the language of the men he was training may have done as much as almost anyone to turn the Continental Army into an army at all. Number 11, Nimitz. This name comes from a different chapter of the larger German-American story, not the colonial Palatine migration, but the later 19th century movement into the Texas Hill Country. Thousands of German families began settling there during the 1840s. Chester Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas, in the heart of that German-Texan community, and was the grandson of a German immigrant sea captain. Nimitz rose through the United States Navy to become commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet during the Second World War, overseeing the naval campaign that turned the tide against Japan across some of the largest battles ever fought at sea. This name is worth pausing on because it reminds us that the German-American story wasn't one migration wave frozen in the 1700s. It continued for more than 2 centuries, in different states and under completely different circumstances, and it kept producing figures who helped shape the course of American history. Number 12, Herr. Hans Herr arrived in Pennsylvania in 1710 as part of an early Mennonite migration and settled in what is now Lancaster County, then still frontier land at the edge of colonial settlement. In 1719, his family built a stone house that remains standing today. The Hans Herr House is now recognized as the oldest surviving building in Lancaster County and one of the oldest Mennonite meeting houses anywhere in North America. Herr became a foundational patriarch of the broader Mennonite community that developed around Lancaster over the following 3 centuries. Descendants of that community still farm much of the same land today. If your family carries the Herr surname or traces back to the Lancaster Mennonite community more broadly, there is a real possibility that the house where your ancestors worshipped 300 years ago is still standing, open to visitors only a few miles from where members of the family may still live. Number 13, Beisel. Conrad Beisel arrived in Pennsylvania in 1720 as a religious mystic seeking complete separation from the mainstream churches around him. In 1732, he founded the Ephrata Cloister, a communal religious settlement in Lancaster County built around celibacy, asceticism, and an original style of devotional music Beisel composed himself. The cloister operated its own printing press and produced some of the largest and most ambitious printed works in colonial America. Those works included a translation of the Martyr's Mirror, running well over 1,000 pages, printed entirely by hand. Because the community was organized around celibacy, Beisel left behind no direct bloodline of his own and no descendants carrying his surname forward in the way most figures in this video did. What he left instead was the cloister itself, still preserved today as a historic site in Lancaster County, along with a body of original American music and printing unlike almost anything else produced in the colonies. Sometimes, the legacy surviving 3 centuries isn't a surname passed down through children. Sometimes, it is a building and a sound that outlived every person who ever sang inside it. Number 14, Zook. The Zook surname is of Swiss-German origin and traces back to an early immigrant named Zug, whose name gradually shifted in America into the form Zook. The surname became closely associated with Amish and Mennonite communities that settled Lancaster County and later spread into communities across several other states. Unlike many names in this video, the Zook line didn't rise toward political authority, military command, or industrial wealth. It did something much rarer. It stayed remarkably similar. Zook families today still farm largely without electricity from the public grid, travel by horse and buggy, and speak Pennsylvania Dutch at home. That language is the same blended German dialect their ancestors carried across the Atlantic 3 centuries ago. Today, Zook remains one of the most common surnames in Amish communities across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and beyond, continuing to multiply generation after generation inside communities that deliberately chose not to dissolve into the surrounding population in the way many other German family lines eventually did. Number 15, Beiler. And this is the name that closes the story because it shows how much of this history never truly became history at all. It simply kept living. Beiler is now one of the most common surnames in the Old Order Amish communities of Lancaster County. The name traces through generations of Amish families who quietly preserved much of the way of life their ancestors brought to America in the 1700s. Plain clothing, horse-drawn transportation, church services held inside private homes rather than dedicated church buildings, and a form of German that has nearly disappeared in Germany itself, but still fills kitchens, barns, and farmyards throughout rural Pennsylvania. Drive through Lancaster County today, and there is a real chance the family working afield with a team of horses carries a surname that arrived on a ship 300 years ago and never once stopped being spoken. 15 names. The refugee family that gave the revolution a general who kept commanding from beneath a tree with a musket ball lodged in his leg. The printer's apprentice whose trial helped create the American idea of a free press. The baker who fed an army and then spent his fortune educating children who were not his own. The missionary who spent 60 years living in the space between two peoples at war. The organizer who built an entire church structure from scattered farming families who had no ministers at all. The Mennonite preacher whose sermon helped create a new American religious denomination on the spot. The wagon shop that grew into one of America's great truck manufacturers. The Palatine farming line that eventually placed its name on one of the tallest buildings in Manhattan. The Pennsylvania Dutch farm boy who rose to command the largest steel operation on earth. The Prussian officer who taught a starving militia how to become a disciplined army. The Texas German admiral who commanded the Pacific War. The stone house still standing after more than 300 years. The mystic who left no children but left behind a building and a body of music that outlived him. And 2 Amish surnames still out there right now, plowing the same fields, speaking the same dialect, and refusing to let 300 years erase the world their ancestors carried across the Atlantic. Here is the number I promised you. Today, people who identify as being of German descent make up the largest single self-reported ancestry group in the United States, somewhere around 45 million people, representing well over 1 in every 10 Americans. Not English, not Mayflower descendants. The quiet, half-frozen refugees who stepped off those ships in 1710, and the tens of thousands who followed them into Pennsylvania and New York throughout the following century. If you're American, the odds that you carry some part of this ancestry are genuinely higher than the odds that you descend from anyone who ever set foot near Plymouth Rock. If your family has roots anywhere in colonial Pennsylvania, the Hudson Valley, or the Mohawk Valley of New York, there is a real possibility that one of these 15 names appears somewhere in your own family tree. Tell me your family's surname. Tell me where your ancestors came from and exactly how far back you've managed to trace them. And share this with anyone you know who carries a German surname but has never stopped to ask where it actually came from. Because the records are still out there waiting, and the history behind these 15 names is stranger, older, and considerably more remarkable than anything most of us were ever taught to look for.